Here's an experiment for you. Take passionate experts in human resource technology. Invite cross-industry experts from inside and outside HR. Mix in what's happening in people analytics today. Give them the technology to connect. Hit record. Pour their discussions into a beaker. Mix thoroughly. And voila, you get the HR Data Labs podcast, where we explore the impact of data and analytics to your business. We may get passionate and even irreverent, but count on each episode challenging and enhancing your understanding of the way people data can be used to solve real-world problems. Now, here's your host, David Turetsky.
Hello and welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast. I am your host, David Turetsky. Like always, we try and find the most interesting people inside and outside the world of human resources to talk to you about HR data, HR analytics, and HR technology. Today, we have with us a fascinating guest by the name of Fred Wills. Hey, Fred, how are you?
I'm doing well, David. Good to be here.
Great to have you. And like always, we have our co-host, Dwight Brown from Salary.com. Hey, Dwight.
Hey, David. How you doing?
I'm awesome.
Good. Fred, nice to have you here.
It's my pleasure. Happy to have this time and chat it up.
Well, Fred, why don't you give our listeners a little bit about your background and who you are?
Gladly. So Fred Wills, as acclaimed, and you've outlined there, thank you. You know, my background, I think we'll go the quick version of this, starts in Miami, growing up in South Florida. That's important because what you have, there's happy accidents. So there's the opportunity to live diversity, and then what would evolve into doing diversity, equity, inclusion work, the ability to kind of read cycles and understand small cultural nuances and things of that sort, right? And that would become really important to doing this work as it progressed forward. But, you know, I got into this work particularly through Peace Corps, through healthcare, but from a family structure that's really about service. It's about giving back. It's about closing that divide between what folks' experiences are. How can we create paths for individuals to be more contributing?
Excellent.
And organizations to walk their talk. So there's a lot of competencies and skills that are in there, but at the end of the day, it's about helping organizations walk their talk, helping leaders lead. And again, I kind of made my space in healthcare at a couple notable places, then move and work really beyond that, in this case, in the consulting space as well.
And you and Dwight actually worked together for a time at Mayo Clinic as well.
That's correct. That's correct.
We did.
That's really cool.
Fred had the yeoman's job of really bringing the organization to the next level with DE&I and did a spectacular job with it. And
outstanding. So, Fred, one fun thing that not many people know about, or hopefully no one knows about you, that we're going to talk about today is what?
Yeah, I would say few. You know, I am a certified whitewater river guide. And wow. I was ready to, I did postgraduate school it was a graduation gift. I think I might have had a semester left. It was a gift there. I was prepared not to go back to graduate school. I enjoyed it that much. You know, it's really cool in terms of reading water. It's adventurous. It'll push you. There's a lot of challenge that's in there. It puts you in your discomfort quickly. Sure. You know, then there's some parallels around how quickly can you adapt to change because the water moves you, right?
It definitely does.
Yeah, but it's exhilarating. And again, very few know that. I can also, you know, do really cool things like know how to cook crock pots in buried ground and throw coals on top, you know, customer service and more, all kinds of good stuff beyond just navigating the water and whatnot.
That really cool. That is really cool. So the next time we find ourselves in the middle of a raging torrent of water, we're going to think of Fred Wills.
There would be worse things and worse people to conjure in that space. I've got at least a little bit of acumen in there.
And on that note, today's topic is on leadership with a lens on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we want to focus specifically on how to lead inclusively to maximize innovation and equity. And it's a beautiful topic, and it's part of our series on DE&I that we're very proud of.
This is William Tincup, and I'd like to direct you to a wonderful limited series podcast that Ryan and I recorded live at the ERE Recruiting Innovation Summit. We sat down with 20 recruiting and TA leaders from around the world to hear what today's best recruiters are doing to stay sharp, stay relevant, and stay ahead. It's called The Talent Shift. You'll love it. You'll find the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Listen, like, review, share. Do you.
Yeah, it's a topic that's not only near and dear. It's not only a topic that has, for obvious reasons, been in the societal cultural norm for right and wrong reasons, but it's something that's also been evolving in the workplace around what was long understood as, I think, poorly positioned as soft skills, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But what we're seeing through, obviously, the resignation, I'm certain you've heard this with the variety of conversations that you're having, the ability to engage folks, to help them feel belonged, and to give them opportunity to develop is as important as ever. Folks are leaving organizations, they're leaving leaders. Whether it doesn't matter the title, whoever their respective leader is, they're leaving for a multitude of reasons, one of which is equitable opportunity.
Right.
And even to put a finer point on it is they're leaving known cultures. They're leaving known circumstances for the unknown. They're not always leaving for greener grass necessarily. They're leaving places that are
well paved. Yep.
Yeah, that are well paved. Right. Correct. It's quite triggering. It's quite interesting that's happening in this space right now. So it's been, I think, a good evolution as to what we're seeing right now.
So, Fred, let's get to the first question, which is, why do so many organizations actually struggle with diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Mm-hmm. I think at the end, it's easy in this work to become very confused and it become convoluted, and to also have these knee-jerk reactions to this work, what you might call just activity as opposed to purposeful action. What's missing oftentimes is this alignment to top strategy. You know, when I have the chance to work with organizations and senior teams, it's understanding where's the business going, where, you know, and not just how conducive is the workspace to equity and inclusion, how's your product design, how your service is delivered. It's really understanding and taking a similar rigor of approach to building equity and inclusion in the organization. You solve it like you do other problems. Plain and simple. Then you see it as an augmenter as opposed to a detractor. Organizations struggle because they fail to align it. They're separating, they're segmenting it off somewhere else. And that's problematic. That's why you see things that are not sustainable. That's why you see these fits and starts. We've seen it. We're going to continue to see it. But the ones that do it well find that alignment through the whole vertical, from the top of their strategy all the way through to kind of frontline employee.
And how do you see those organizations who get it and who do that alignment? What are the common attributes of those companies? What are they doing well that leads to success versus the others that, you know, they're struggling with it? They will struggle whether they do struggle with it. What are the common denominators there?
Yeah, completely. You know, I think one of which is moving away from perfection. It's also, and with that comes in hand, this embracing of failure. Now, my background, Dwight's background, is in healthcare. Failures means sentinel events. It means things you don't, outcomes you don't want. But it's understanding how to embrace failure as fail fast. Where do we have space that we can try something different to solve problems and a new solution? That's probably the most major characteristic that's there. The other piece that's there is around inclusive leadership. And you can look at all kinds of literature, all kinds of entities that are there, pick many. But if you look thematically to all of them, they embrace this shift in not just mindset, but an approach from a fixed leadership style to a more fluid kind of range, right? How do you embody attributes of inclusive leadership, authenticity, openness, curiosity, but also challenging? How do you challenge the status quo that's there as well? A couple other things that are major attributes for organizations that do well in this space, that are more mature, if you will. You have obviously the psychological safety that's incentivized and rewarded. It's expected. There's a second characteristic that's there that speaks to transparency of what we're doing and why. And there's some similarities to change management, right? So you're speaking to what the change is, why we're doing it, and you're consistently relating back to your values. That's really important. That runs through the kind of vertical and horizontal of an organization. So we're going to make space. We're going to make a decision moving this direction. Then you speak to that philosophy again and again. And the more consistently you can do that, what you see is kind of moving up that maturity model. In addition to that, I would say that probably the other major attribute that's there is expecting and rewarding openness and diverse thinking. The more quickly and more readily that's embraced for idea generation or solution solving, solutions and problem solving. Those are kind of the major attributes and characteristics. That's the foundation of those kind of 4 attributes that are there. That's what helps folks move, ascend up the kind of the maturity model, if you will. You have to have those in place. Otherwise, you've got a shaky system. There's more, but those are the base.
So let me ask you a stupid question, though. When they begin and, in taking all of those pieces, do they have a problem with figuring out how to understand where they are today and setting a baseline? And then how do they figure out how they're measuring where they're going, and are they successful getting there? So I guess the question is there a measurement, and then is there a goal setting based on the measurement of what's going on today? And I don't mean, when I talk about measurement, I talk about engagement. I talk about promotional opportunities. I talk about what is the picture of today and what does better look like? Because people so often tend to think about, and even with those 4 attributes you're outlining, people think of these things as getting better is setting quotas.
Right.
And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, how do we measure progress to see, are we getting more alignment? Are we getting more transparency? Are we getting more leadership? How are we measuring those attributes that you talked about to be able to say we're getting better? Where do we go? Where do we start there?
You're completely right. And I love the way you elaborated on what's meant. And part of the implicit point of what you're talking about is that numbers, representation, those are outcome things. They're super important, but they're not the only thing. And that's kind of what I've kind of coined over time is those are missed the point moments. If we're focusing on just the number, solely the number, then we're missing the point of what we're trying to do. Right. We're trying to create this workplace that creates opportunity and gives development for all. Right? You might have a differential focus at times. That's really important. To the point of your question, it's about assessment in the system. There's a great. You have to keep in mind that structural inclusion and equity is what maintains behavioral inclusion and equity. So you have to understand the water and the structure which you're in. So you have to do the assessment, right? And it can be daunting because there's a lot. I'll give you an example. One of the stops that I had was obviously Mayo Clinic that Dwight spoke to. If you look at just the span of work, just to give a really practical example, the span of that work was to look in all elements of the organization. So the things you'd naturally guess, patient experience and outcome, quality, right? Workforce diversity, there's things you might naturally guess that would fit in this space. But you also have things around economic development. You have things around how does the brand resonate with emerging audiences, emerging potential patient bases. It's really breadth. I won't extend too much in it, but you have to assess all those pieces. And then you have to, plainly, you have to also, assessment work is validating and confirming, but it's also a really tough look in the mirror. And when we come back to one of those first things around being authentic, you have to look at some of those warts. You have to be able, it's assessing how do people advance here? How do they not advance? When do they leave? All of some of the workplace movement metrics that are there. Equal to that, in working with groups right now, it's starting with board, it's starting with senior teams about what are you actually incentivizing? That's a really key assessment. And so the more quickly you can get to openness on that conversation and establish a baseline, and then you have to repeat that baseline back to that idea of philosophy, saying, here's what we learned some great things. We learned some pretty concerning things, but speaking pretty truthfully about that, you have to continue to speak again and again to that end, because what that is doing is not, it's positively signaling. It's not virtue signaling. It's positively signaling to the organization that we're trying to have growth in this particular space, whether that is leadership development and advancement, whether that's in design of a product or service. The way I think about apply assessment is it's a really tough look in the mirror. It's an opportunity to look at your warts, grin and bear it a little bit, but it's formative and it's informative and it's instructive.
And I think that what you've outlined then provides people with an opportunity to say, okay, how do I take this assessment? Where is it? Where do I go? And who does it? Because HR gets labeled the team that is always the go-to on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is probably the worst place you could go. And for all the HR people, I've been in HR for 30 years. I love HR, but we get given these assignments that are really unfair to be assigned to us because we're trying to keep the lights on. We're trying to keep the COVID vaccination records. We're trying to do this, that, and the other thing. And then you're asking us to take a critical look at what we do and how we do it and how the leadership team is doing it. And that's tough.
Yep.
So, sorry, this is a long-winded way of asking. Who does that assessment?
Yeah, so I can tell you when Dwight and I shared time at Mayo Clinic, we actually built an in-house tool to do that. Again, that's very uncommon. We had the resources, we had the organizational interest, we had organizational energy. There are groups that are doing it really well, and plainly, there's a saturation of folks that are not. What I would tell you is not to recommend a specific place or organization necessarily, but what I would recommend is paying attention to the depth of what they're measuring. Right? Are they measuring respect? Are they measuring distributed authority? Transparency, growth, trust. Those are kind of dimensions that are really, really valuable when you're thinking about wanting to understand the kind of organizational climate and culture. And that climate and culture spills out to everything that's done, not just internally, but outside of the walls of said organization. And to your question around ownership, one of the lessons I was, two things I'll say there. One is I worked for a VP many years ago. I worked at a high-standing pediatric organization. And my VP then said, we need to approach at the time it was D&I work. The E was not as prominent.
Yeah.
He's like, we need to approach this work like we approach quality. It can't sit in isolation. It cannot flat out. It needs to be owned. And so what that did in my particular approach, and back to this around organizations that do really well in this space, they can integrate it, but it's not diluted. And you can point to it and talk about what's the measurement, what's the action. It's not the point where you can't find it. Oftentimes I'm a fan of HR. I'm not an HRist. I've been proxy to it over the years, just to be very plain. In terms of ownership, I think there's also the key thing to keep in mind is that you can make arguments for why it should be in HR. I would actually make more arguments outside of that. What you're looking for in this role being done well, you're looking for latitude and empowerment and authority. Right? To be able to speak to other pieces of the business that are not just the human capital centric things. Those are important. And then the other thing that I would tell you, I would share, is that understanding the centrality of the business is super vital, right? Sure. So whether you are healthcare, which is how do you get the best care possible and how do you recruit the best talent to give that care, or whether it's in education tech or fintech, doesn't really matter. That DEI person has to understand the centrality of the business, and they need to have the empowerment to speak to things that can complement senior leaders. It's a fusion of skills, right? So a good DEI person will talk about why it's important and structure the work as to its relevance, but it's that kind of partnership with senior leadership to build execution against the needs.
But I think it also, and it's one thing that you were talking about that I really kind of sparked in my mind, independence. They have to be able to be independent and have an ability to call bullshit, PG-13, has the ability to call out leaders or HR specific groups when they're not pulling their weight, when they're not doing what needs to be done, at least from what the leadership team is talking about, and actually live the values that they're trying to drive.
You're exactly right. We talked earlier about why organizations struggle. The failure to, or the reluctance to not give someone license to say bad things about the organization, but say, hey, this is a real problem. And to be kind of a conduit of where there are endemic issues, where there are these little cultural things that cumulatively add up over time. For instance, that are problematic, you have to have the authority to do that. Again, having had some acknowledgement in this space and whatnot, the bosses, the folks that I've worked for, and I would say leaders, probably better than bosses, the leaders I've worked for, they pull you into the right conversations. They step out of the way of conversations that they're just setting you up for, and they pull back and they trust you, right? And they also provide cover. They also give you a big picture.
Yes.
There's a lot of dexterity, but that doesn't happen in great abundance, just to be very plain. It does not happen in great abundance.
One thing that I think of with this is if you look historically, kind of how DE&I has progressed, where, I remember a time where it was all about looking at the stats and reporting the stats to the government.
Sure.
And it wasn't necessarily about doing the right thing for the right reasons. And I'm interested in your perspective. Do you feel like that has hindered DE&I efforts when you look at that historical aspect of things and trying to get over what's the next step? How do we take this to the next level? How do we get to the point of what you were just talking about? And do you think that that's why some organizations struggle?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a whole legacy lineage of that style of reporting, and it's
Yep.
equal part good, but there's probably at this point there's probably a lot of quote unquote baggage that's with it. The real concerning piece that there is the mindset that's associated with it, which is why I kind of started our conversation and appreciate the question of where's the organization going?
Yeah.
And what's the people talent? What could that look like? I've always been a DEI person. That when I advise organizations, how do you want to structure your D&I work? It is actually not through HR necessarily. It is in partnership and concert to a lot of that stuff. There's a problematic history of being limited to what was kind of historical EEO work, EEO focused stuff, as opposed to saying, how do we create an environment that incentivizes development and opportunity, that embraces different perspective, that embraces positive deviance at a micro level, that endorses it at a managerial level, that says managers, as opposed to holding the line, saying, you actually have to be one of our change folks. We actually need you to be agitating and challenging some of that. And then moving up the ladder. You can go, north or south with that idea through the vertical of the organization.
Dwight, when you said that, the Q word came to my mind. Quotas.
Yeah.
Right. And I lived in a world where, unfortunately, that was the conversation in HR. Are we living on values? No, it wasn't about living the values. It was about, are we hiring to our quotas? And that was awful. And I'm glad that those days should be in our rearview mirror.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking subscribe. This podcast is made possible by Salary.com. Now, back to the show.
But I wanted to pivot a bit, Fred, if you don't mind, to talk about leadership and to talk about how we can get leaders to step up and actually start leading inclusively and create another or a different work environment where they're leading through example. They're showing the values that we need to be showing for their ownership, their shareholders, for the world, their consumers, who's actually buying their services or products, but even more so for the people who rely on them, as you just mentioned, for the examples of how to act differently, how to think differently. Sorry, not differently, inclusively.
Yeah. I have the chance to work with a lot of senior teams, and there are differing levels of understanding in this space. And at times, I'll hear feedback that says, "Oh, this sounds like just leadership as opposed to diversity, equity, inclusion." Like, and I always go, "Huh." Give them a little pause.
Interesting.
You're kind of there. You're kind of missing it, but you're kind of there, right? So you draw that out a little bit more, right? So how do you get there, right? How do you get folks there? The plain and simple is senior leaders cast the biggest shadows. That's just a fact, right? They set the tone, they set the accountabilities. That's just a fact, right? So, and this work is complex in the sense that it's an individual path and it's a structural path, right? So back to this ability to see yourselves. There's what I would recommend and see worked really well is reflection of leadership paths. It's also, and again, we've got countless examples of some of this stuff, but it's about having a bit of courageousness and facing the wind It is speaking. You get more traction in this space as a leader, whether you're a capital L leader, right, by title, or leader by some other definition. And my definition is you influence people. That makes you a leader, right? You get more by being authentic, even if you're making a mistake in what you're saying.
Right.
There's a lot. So I would say tell the story, but also articulate where you're trying to get to, right? And give folks space to do that. Yeah. So I would probably start there as one point, and then kind of that tough look in the mirror. You were kind of hitting it earlier, this assessment. And again, if you're picking, and we're talking about an HR group, I would say let's look at how do we really understand folks ascending in the organization? Really, really strong looks. And those are, again, I use this phrase of tough looks in the mirror. That's what all these are. And if you really want to put a punctuation point on it, ask yourself, and your employees will tell you, your staff will tell you, do you actually have the will to do it? Do you actually have that will? This is really tough work. It'll always be tough work, but it's transformative. So I would say take inputs that you don't normally get. It's easy to get feedback from the usual suspects. I would move to the unusual, the unexpected suspects, if you will.
So one of the problems that you talked about really early in our podcast was transparency. And transparency leads to new processes. New processes are hard. They actually take investment. They actually take real money. This is not talking about measurement. This is talking about changing stuff that we do that will impact cost and will probably require changing how people think about how they work and how they do things. And I'll give you an example. If we typically look at 5 or 6 Ivy League schools to hire from, and we have established relationships, we may even have endowments with them.
Correct.
We may now want to look at the HBCUs. We may want to look at other areas which produce phenomenal results and produce wonderful human beings that are brilliant, that can give us diverse thought, give us diverse actions, give us a better representation of our consumers and of the population as a whole. But it will take a lot of money to do that. It may actually require some technology change too. But we have to change our HRIS. We have to maybe change the way in which we recruit. So the question I want to ask you is, when the leaders buy in, do we sometimes forget about that price tag that has to go alongside of these actions in order to be able to fully, really embrace change?
The core of this work is about change, period. And I mean this work being DEI work and DEIB work, belonging.
Yeah.
To your question, part of the argument you could say is, and now is a really great example. Look at how fast folks are leaving the organization. It's a 6-figure cost, right, to bring someone on. That's kind of the baseline of some of that. So you actually have some of the economics there pretty readily, kind of out the gate. I would say that the price tag of transparency is, yes, there's an actual hard figure that's there, but I would actually say some of it actually doesn't have high cost attached to it, meaning that openness to embracing a different way of doing things, getting employee feedback, or through that, there's an openness to receiving direction and feedback, taking the advantage of folks' previous experiences, and then you speak to that. There's a transparency that's there. So I think yes, it's a both and. There's a financial cost that's there. I won't split hairs around what the hard costs are. I will tell you there's a concerning to this point, right? Is somewhere last year I remember reading a data point that said $60+ billion were committed in between summer of 2020 and through mid-year of 2021. $60 billion. It was short of $1 million actual spent, or $250 million actually spent.
Wow.
My point, right? The point is, external pressures can cause this wanting to speak into a space for right or wrong reasons. But we go back to executive alignment, and we understand the criticality of, if I don't pay attention to this, there is an even bigger financial impact to all this stuff, right? Beyond the cost that might come in with changing, whether it's ATS system or, some form of trying to eradicate bias that's in there, right? The cost actually speaks to itself pretty quickly without needing to be encyclopedic on it. And so And what happens there is that's a double standard that gets applied to DEI often and inappropriately over time. You don't necessarily see the same double standard applied to, I don't know, we'll just say innovation and product development, right? You get a more latitude, right?
Yeah,
and so
absolutely.
Long way of saying transparency in some cases is a financial cost, but there's also, there are actions that I think leaders and organizations can take that speak to transparency. And some of that starts with saying, hey, we're not where we want to be, but we're committed to growing through this growth. And focusing, super important. You talked about alignment as well. That's really valuable too.
So one of the first things that I think could help in the world of transparency is the don't worry, we have your back. So managers or leaders, to give that speech and then live it by saying, don't worry, I have your back. If something happens and you need to do something, like to us, equity is part of what we do every day. We want to make sure that we're building equitable compensation programs and that compensation is equitable as it's being delivered. And if a manager is doing the right thing and saying, I see a disparity here and I want to fix it, to know that your leader has your back when you go and make the request, because they used to not be automatic. Yep. It used to take time to get that money, but every paycheck is another inequitable occurrence.
Yep.
And so to have that leader be transparent and to have my back to say, I'm going to fix this, that's huge.
And I think along with that, having transparency also offers the possibility of crowdsourcing. In other words, if you're having difficulty moving the needle, moving the dial on things, outside ideas can really help along that path. Because as a leader, we only see so much of our world and we look through a lens, but having somebody else who can say, did you look at this? Did you think about it this way? And really making it a we thing as opposed to a me thing is what I think of with that. But if you don't have that transparency, then you're never going to get the outside thought that you need. You'll get a lot of opinions, but having the ability to have somebody else who looks at things a different way and help to move the dial, I think there's value in that.
There's a strong relationship between transparency and growth. There's a really strong relationship between those things. Transparency is also defined sometimes by industry, but it's particularly defined by each organization. So I think coming to some level of definition on that's super important. And to the point around crowdsourcing, if you will, I think it's also particularly important to let folks articulate, staff, frontline folks, those at least outside of management, maybe by some level of definition, and then on your way up, defining what transparency is as opposed to the other way around. If you're trying to retain folks, right, it's super important to actually let them define some of that. Doesn't mean everything can be done, but it is important to know. And some of the things you'll be able to do. And then in terms of the have your back, wow, if we have another hour, we can talk about that topic.
Unfortunately, Fred.
Yeah. So, but I'll say one thing that speaks really well to the need to have an equitable, inclusive system that is structural, right? That is structural, but also incentivizes those related behaviors, right? The behavior is historically was the manager saying, let me go look at it, right? The structural is that now there's a system that looks for anomalies that can do it, in a snap, that can do it in a month's pay period, if you will. So you have to have both and. This is a both and kind of proposition.
So, Fred, I think what we're going to have to do is have you back for another conversation so we can get that hour in. Because while I love talking about this, I love our listeners and they have time that they put aside for us. Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask: is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that we want to quickly add to the conversation, or do you want to reserve that for the next time we talk?
I will say something quite expressly. That is,
Sure.
one, every leader, and then that's defined as someone that has the ability to influence someone else. A strong reflection on treating folks equitably and inclusively, and that means largely doing something different. So have some curiosity attached to that. Asking folks what their sense of belonging is, where they have opportunities to contribute that are being under-realized, would be another thing I would leave is here. And then really these hard looks, and this is a leadership action. How are you looking at how you're allocating resources, right, amongst your team and in a variety of ways? How are you distributing those resources and looking for differential impact? That'd be my immediate recommendations to kind of close our conversation.
And by the way, that last piece that you just threw out there, that's an entire podcast. And we've actually had conversations around that with people and talking about opportunities, not just promotional opportunities, but opportunities to work.
Yep.
And the bias that is inside of managers or people who do staffing around what I perceive someone to be able to do versus what can they actually do, and giving them the opportunity to work a number of hours and to work overtime. So that could be a completely separate podcast for us.
Very cool.
But Fred, thank you so much. It's been awesome talking to you today. And I will welcome you back again, or we will welcome you back, right, Dwight?
Yes, we will.
And so thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for listening. And if you know somebody who might find this conversation fascinating the way Dwight and I did, please send it their way. If you liked it, please hit subscribe. And we hope we will bring you many more conversations, especially with Mr. Wills. Thank you very much. Take care, and please stay safe.
That was the HR Data Labs podcast. If you liked the episode, please subscribe. And if you know anyone that might like to hear it, please send it their way. Thank you for joining us this week, and stay tuned for our next episode. Stay safe.